Well, let's switch to writing. How I know a little bit about your background in that you studied writing and that you have spent some time in the theater world as well. Um, what triggered the switch into writing as a full-time profession?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's not really a very sensible thing to do, is it? To take up writing as the way of feeding yourself. But I guess it all stemmed from, one question that I'm sure you're the same. One question you get a lot is, did you always want to be a writer? Did you imagine yourself when you were a little kid, being a novelist? And a lot of people, and my wife included, she would make little books, when she was small, handwritten, and she would cut out pieces of cardboard from cereal packets to make the covers and everything. She always wanted to do it. I never really did, honestly. It's a stupid thing to say because I've always been a really voracious reader, passionate reader. But I never thought beyond the book. I never really considered the people that wrote them or the industry that's involved in producing them. I just thought about the books themselves. Because what mattered to me was the stories. I just always, looking back, I realized I always loved telling stories. So when I was a little kid, this was back in the day where if you went out in the family car, there were no seat belts, there was nothing, so I'd be a little kid standing out kind of between the front seats, would be driving up maybe to my grandparents' house, and it would be boring. So I would tell a story to fill the time. And my parents said there was always this thing. Every story would always start off with something that had happened, something at school that day or in the house with my brothers. And then there'd be a certain point where I'd say, and then suddenly, and then they knew that's where we were, diving off down the rabbit hole. And from that point on, I just always loved telling stories. Something happened to you in your life, maybe something bad, maybe something troublesome, but I would be delighted because it would be fodder for for the next story I was going to tell. And it continued through, once I was at high school, if I hadn't done my homework, I didn't worry about it because I could always think up a good enough story that I could get out of trouble with the teachers, or, it went on like that right through to my first proper job when I was working in telecommunications. Something terrible would happen, we'd screw something up and it would be horrendous, but it would be a great story. So that would really be all I cared about. So storytelling was the thing. And what I wound up doing was after high school, in high school, I loved English literature. It was my favorite thing. Um, and that was a lot down to the teachers we had. They were the best teachers that there were. And they would introduce you to these wonderful books and poems and plays. And they would encourage you to think for yourself and come up with your own ideas about these things. And then the lessons would just be these fantastic kind of verbal sparring matches, about, well, I think this, well, no, I think that. And, that was what I loved to do. And I had this idea that if I went to university to do English literature, it would be like high school, but bigger and better. So I wanted to do English literature, and the teachers kind of pulled me to one side and said, Andrew, you shouldn't really do that because honestly, you're not very good at it. You should just do something else like economics. But one of my big flaws is that I'm very bad at taking advice, and I'm very stubborn. So as soon as I had that idea in my head, I was determined to do it. So off I go to university. And I discover that at university, it is the exact opposite experience to what I'd had at high school. The teachers were all these internationally renowned academics, who'd made their names with certain theories. And if you challenged those theories, they didn't encourage it because they thought, great, now we can have a really interesting debate. No, they took it as an insult because you weren't kind of bowing down and worshipping them because they had this amazing idea. And so I did really, really badly. And to the point that I wanted to quit. I didn't want to do English literature anymore. But back then, it's a little different now, but back then in England, if you went, you had to, it's a little different to the States. You didn't apply to a university and then later decide on your major. You had to apply up front for the course that you wanted to major in, and then you were pretty much stuck with it. There was only a very small amount of wiggle room. If you wanted to change completely, you would have to leave and then come back the next year. And the problem with leaving would be it would look like giving up or failing. And in my family, my father in particular, he was very kind of strict Northern Irishman who was been in the army. You know, for him, there was no giving up. Once you had set out on a path, you stayed on that path till the end. So it wasn't really an option to drop out and come back later. So the most I could do was switch to English and drama. And so doing drama was life-changing for me, really, because if you think about telling a story, you know, we tell stories with the written word on the page, but how much better a way of telling a story really is having people speak the lines and act out the actions live in front of you. It's fantastic. So I completely fell in love with it, with drama. And at the end of the degree, there were five of my friends and me, we were talking about it, and we thought, you know, are we really ready to get the mortgage and the 9 to 5 job and all of that, you know, when there were all of these opportunities that we had got a glimpse of during the course? Because you know how it is. You're doing something for an exam. You can't follow it through all the way. You have to do enough to pass the test and then you have to move on. And so we thought there's all of these things that we've scratched, but we haven't got to the bottom of. Let's set up our own theatre company so that we can focus on the stuff that's important to us. So we did that. And you know, a lot of theatre companies, the sensible theatre companies, they'll want to do some experimental stuff, but they know it has to be paid for. So what they'll do is they'll normally alternate. You know, they'll have a well-known play, a Shakespeare or something like that, and then something experimental so that they can make money. We didn't do that. We were just completely self-indulgent. We knew weren't going to be doing it forever. So all we did was our own new stuff. So when you've got a brand new theatre company that no one has ever heard of, doing plays that no one has ever heard of, you know, it's very hard to keep a roof over your head. So we were actually very organized for 18-year-olds. We, or however old we were, 21, 22, I suppose. We you know, we had a plan, we had a bank account, we were on this government enterprise scheme for a little bit of extra cash, and we did achieve everything we set out to achieve, but it took us 2 years rather than 1 year. And at the end of that, you know, we had to decide what to do, and I was just kind of sick of being broke. And so I needed a job. So I looked in those days, pre-internet, no Starlink in your cabin, you know, you know, you had to go out and buy the newspaper. And in those days in England, the graduate jobs were all in the Sunday Times. So I bought a copy of the Sunday Times and I took this very, very scientific approach. What I did was I cut out all of the adverts for jobs that I thought I could even conceivably try to do. And I put them in order of starting salary. Because I was broke. I applied for the one that was offering the most money and by some miracle got that job. And I planned on just doing it for a year or two until, you know, I wasn't broke anymore. But that's never how things go. I wound up stuck in that industry for like 15 years. And it was during that time that, you know, I started to think, you know, this is okay. I'm making an okay living, but this isn't really what I want to do. I really want to be a writer. And, you know, when you talk to people, you meet them at a party or in the pub, for whatever reason in our society, people always want to know what you do. It kind of defines you. You know, you bump into somebody and they're, well, what do you do? And I'd always say, well, I work in the telecom industry, but really I'm going to be a writer. And after a while, I thought, you know, I need to actually stop just saying I'm going to do this and find out if I can do it. And one day, the real clincher, I heard somebody say that the two saddest words in the English language are what if. And I thought, I don't want to get to the end of my time and look back and say, yeah, I did okay, but what if I tried writing? So I decided to do it. I started trying to work on my first novel at the same time as working in the industry, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't keep the momentum going. I kept having to break off when I was on the road for a week or whatever, and I just forgot where I was up to. So I just had to take the jump. I had to quit the job. I managed to get a severance package with enough money to support me for a year. So I thought, okay, I work on this book for a year. It'll either work or it won't. And if it doesn't, I'll have to kind of crawl back with my tail between my legs and beg for my old job back. But you know, fortunately, I finished that book and I managed to get it published. And you know what it's like from there on. It's just like, you know, book to book, and still clinging on. It's actually 20 years in next month. 20 years since I quit my real job.
Well, that's a fascinating